In a world where military hierarchy rules with iron discipline, where questioning orders can mean the end of a career, one young woman faced an impossible choice. When respect turns to abuse and authority becomes tyranny, sometimes the only option left is to fight back. This is the true story of Sarah Martinez, a 22-year-old Army private who discovered that real strength doesn't come from rank or position. It comes from refusing to be broken. What happened in that training facility on a scorching Tuesday afternoon would change everything. It would expose the dark side of military culture, challenge the very foundations of command structure, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to stay down. This is her story, raw, unfiltered, and absolutely true. Sarah Martinez had dreamed of military service since she was 12 years old. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she watched her grandfather polish his Vietnam War medals every Sunday morning, listening to his stories about brotherhood, honor, and serving something greater than yourself. Those tales filled her young mind with visions of purpose and pride. She would stand at attention in their living room, saluting his faded photograph in uniform, promising herself that one day she would wear those same colors. The decision to enlist came naturally after high school graduation. While her classmates headed off to college parties and student loans, Sarah walked into the Army recruitment office with determination burning in her dark eyes. The recruiter, a friendly staff sergeant with kind eyes, painted pictures of travel, education benefits, and the chance to make a real difference in the world. She signed the papers that same day, much to her family's mixed emotions. Her mother cried quietly at the kitchen table that evening, not from disappointment, but from fear. Her father, a construction worker with calloused hands and a gentle heart, simply nodded and said he was proud. Her grandfather, now 83 and walking with a cane, pulled her aside and whispered words that would later prove prophetic. The uniform doesn't make the person, Mija. The person makes the uniform. Remember that when things get tough. Basic training at Fort Benning was everything Sarah expected and nothing like she imagined. The physical challenges excited her. She had always been athletic, playing soccer and running track in high school. The mental games and psychological pressure were harder to navigate. Drill sergeants screamed inches from faces, broke down civilian identities, and rebuilt soldiers from the ground up. Sarah adapted quickly, finding strength in the structure and camaraderie among her fellow recruits. She excelled in marksmanship, scored high on fitness tests, and showed natural leadership qualities that didn't go unnoticed. Other recruits looked to her during difficult moments, drawn to her calm determination and unwavering optimism. Even the toughest drill sergeants began to respect her work ethic and positive attitude. Sarah began to believe she had found her calling. After basic training, Sarah received orders to Fort Hood for advanced individual training in logistics. The base sprawled across central Texas like a small city, housing thousands of soldiers and their families. The transition from the controlled environment of basic training to the more relaxed atmosphere of AIT felt like stepping into a different world. Here, soldiers had more freedom, more responsibility, and, unfortunately, more opportunities for both growth and trouble. Her new unit was the 45th Logistics Battalion, commanded by Colonel Patricia Williams, a respected officer known for her fairness and dedication to soldier welfare. Sarah felt optimistic about her placement, especially after meeting her company commander, Captain James Rodriguez, who seemed genuinely interested in developing his soldiers' careers. The first few weeks passed smoothly as Sarah learned her new role managing supply chains and coordinating equipment distribution. The trouble began with the arrival of Sergeant First Class Derek Hammond. Hammond transferred from another base under circumstances that were never fully explained to the lower-ranking soldiers. What was clear was his reputation for being a hard-charging leader who demanded perfection and brooked no excuses. At 38 years old, Hammond was a career soldier with multiple deployments and a chest full of ribbons that spoke to his military accomplishments. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders and piercing blue eyes, Hammond commanded attention the moment he walked into any room. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Other soldiers straightened unconsciously when he passed, and even seasoned NCOs treated him with particular deference. To Sarah and her fellow privates, he seemed like the epitome of military bearing and professionalism. Hammond's first interaction with Sarah occurred during a routine equipment inventory. She was carefully checking serial numbers against manifest sheets when his shadow fell across her workspace. Looking up, She snapped to attention and gave a crisp salute. Hammond returned the salute casually, his eyes scanning her work with what appeared to be professional interest. "Private Martinez," he said, reading her name tape. "I've heard good things about your performance and training." "Thank you, Sergeant," Sarah replied, maintaining her position of attention. "At ease," Hammond commanded, and Sarah relaxed slightly. "I like soldiers who take pride in their work. Keep it up." The interaction seemed positive, even encouraging. Sarah felt a surge of pride that such an experienced NCO had taken notice of her efforts. She returned to her inventory with renewed energy, unaware that she had just caught the attention of someone who would soon turn her world upside down. Over the following weeks, Hammond began to single Sarah out for additional duties and training opportunities. At first, she felt honored by the extra attention. While other soldiers complained about mundane tasks, Sarah found herself assigned to more complex logistics operations, working directly with Hammond to coordinate shipments and manage supply schedules. She told herself it was recognition of her capabilities and dedication. The dynamic shifted subtly, but persistently. Hammond's professional demeanor gradually gave way to more personal interactions. He began asking about her background, her family, her reasons for joining the Army. During these conversations, he would move closer than necessary, his voice taking on a softer tone that made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. She tried to maintain professional boundaries, but Hammond's rank and authority made direct confrontation difficult. Other soldiers began to notice Hammond's special attention to Sarah, leading to whispered conversations and sideways glances. Some expressed concern, having heard rumors about Hammond's behavior at previous assignments. Others suggested Sarah was receiving favorable treatment and should appreciate the opportunities. The mixed reactions left Sarah confused and isolated, unsure whether her discomfort was justified or if she was overreacting to normal mentorship. The situation escalated during a late evening when Hammond assigned Sarah to inventory duty in a remote supply warehouse. The building sat at the edge of the base, away from the main activity areas and foot traffic. Sarah arrived as instructed, finding Hammond already there, supposedly conducting his own inspection of equipment readiness. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows between towering stacks of supplies and equipment, creating an atmosphere that felt immediately wrong. "Close the door behind you, Private," Hammond instructed without looking up from his clipboard. "We need to ensure security while handling sensitive equipment." Sarah hesitated briefly before complying, her instincts sending warning signals that she tried to suppress. She had been trained to follow orders without question, and challenging a senior NCO required more courage than she felt she possessed in that moment. The warehouse door clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Hammond's behavior changed immediately. His professional facade dropped away, replaced by something predatory that made Sarah's skin crawl. He moved between her and the door, effectively blocking her exit while maintaining the pretense of conducting official business. His questions became increasingly personal and inappropriate, crossing boundaries that had nothing to do with military duties. "You know, Martinez," Hammond said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that felt completely inappropriate for their setting. "I've been watching you. You have potential, but you need the right kind of guidance. Someone who understands what it takes to really succeed in this man's army." Sarah focused on her clipboard, trying to project professionalism while her heart rate accelerated. "I appreciate your guidance, Sergeant. I'm committed to doing my best." "I know you are," Hammond replied, moving closer. "The question is whether you're committed to doing whatever it takes." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sarah understood with crystal clarity that this conversation had nothing to do with her military career and everything to do with Hammond's personal agenda. Her grandfather's words echoed in her memory. "The person makes the uniform." Looking at Hammond now, she realized that some people wore uniforms without earning the right to the honor they represented. Sarah excused herself as professionally as possible, citing the need to complete her assigned duties. Hammond allowed her to leave, but his parting words contained a clear warning about the consequences of not being team players in his unit. As Sarah walked back to her barracks through the Texas night, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The young woman who had entered that warehouse was still there, but something fundamental had changed. The naive optimism about military service had been replaced by a hard realization about the reality of power dynamics and abuse of authority. Sarah Martinez was about to learn that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought against foreign enemies, but against the corruption that can exist within your own ranks. Her real test was just beginning, and Tomorrow would bring challenges that would define not just her military career but her character as a human being. The girl who had saluted her grandfather's photograph was about to discover what true courage really meant. The morning after the warehouse incident brought no relief for Sarah Martinez. She woke before reveille, her mind racing with thoughts about the previous evening's encounter with Sergeant Hammond. Sleep had been fitful, filled with dreams where she found herself trapped in that warehouse, while Hammond's voice echoed from the shadows. She lay in her narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling while her bunkmate snored softly nearby, trying to process what had happened and what it might mean for her future. During morning formation, Hammond's eyes found hers across the assembled ranks. His gaze held longer than appropriate, carrying a message that made Sarah's stomach twist with anxiety. Captain Rodriguez conducted the morning briefing with his usual professionalism, outlining the day's training schedule and administrative requirements. But Sarah barely heard the words. Her attention remained fixed on Hammond, who stood at attention with the other NCOs but somehow managed to project an aura of menace that seemed directed specifically at her. The day's duties felt different now, tainted by an undercurrent of threat that hadn't existed before. Sarah went through the motions of her logistics training, checking inventory sheets and coordinating supply movements, but every sound of approaching footsteps made her tense with anticipation. Other soldiers began to notice her distraction, asking if she felt well or needed help with her assignments. She deflected their concerns with forced smiles and assurances that everything was fine. Hammond waited until afternoon to make his next move. Sarah was working alone in the supply office, updating computer records when he appeared in the doorway. His arrival was silent, predatory, and she didn't notice his presence until his reflection appeared in her computer screen. The realization that he had been watching her work sent ice through her veins. Private Martinez. His voice carried the false friendliness that she was beginning to recognize as a warning sign. I need you to accompany me for a special assignment. Sarah's training demanded immediate compliance, but every instinct screamed danger. She saved her work with deliberately slow movements, buying time to think while Hammond waited with growing impatience. The office suddenly felt smaller, more confined, as if the walls were closing in around her. What type of assignment, Sergeant? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady and professional. Hammond's smile never reached his eyes. Equipment verification at the auxiliary storage facility. It requires someone with your attention to detail. The auxiliary storage facility was even more isolated than the previous night's warehouse, located nearly a mile from the main base activities. Sarah had been there once during her initial orientation, noting its remote location and the fact that it rarely saw regular traffic. The thought of being alone there with Hammond filled her with dread. Sergeant, I'm currently in the middle of updating these supply records for tomorrow's briefing, Sarah said, grasping for any legitimate excuse to avoid the assignment. Hammond's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Private, are you questioning my orders? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Sarah understood the trap she faced. Refusing a direct order from a senior NCO could result in disciplinary action, damage to her military record, or worse. But complying meant putting herself in exactly the type of isolated situation that had made her so uncomfortable the night before. No, Sergeant, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Good, Hammond said, his smile returning. Get your gear. We leave in 10 minutes. As Sarah gathered her equipment, her hands shook slightly with a combination of fear and anger. The anger surprised her with its intensity. She had joined the army to serve her country, to be part of something honorable and meaningful. Instead, she found herself being manipulated by someone who abused his position and authority for personal gain. The betrayal felt almost worse than the fear. The drive to the auxiliary storage facility took place in Hammond's personal vehicle, a decision that immediately raised red flags for Sarah. Military protocol typically required official transportation for duty assignments, and the use of a private vehicle suggested this mission was anything but official. Hammond maintained casual conversation during the drive, asking about her family and hometown as if they were simply colleagues heading to routine work. The storage facility sat surrounded by empty fields, its concrete walls and small windows giving it the appearance of a bunker rather than a supply depot. Hammond parked behind the building, away from the main road, ensuring their vehicle wouldn't be visible to passing traffic. As they walked toward the entrance, Sarah noticed the absence of any other vehicles or signs of activity. They were completely alone. Inside, the facility felt even more oppressive than the previous night's warehouse. Rows of metal shelving stretched into shadows, filled with equipment that appeared to have been forgotten rather than actively managed. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows, and the air carried the musty smell of disuse. Sarah's footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, each sound amplifying her sense of isolation and vulnerability. Hammond wasted little time with pretense once they were inside. His professional demeanor evaporated entirely, replaced by something that made Sarah's skin crawl with revulsion. He moved to block the exit again, but this time his intentions were unmistakably clear. The equipment verification was a fiction, a pretense to get her alone where no one could witness what he had planned. "You know why we're really here, don't you, Martinez?" Hammond's voice had taken on a quality that made Sarah's blood run cold. Sarah backed away slowly, her mind racing through possible escape routes and self-defense techniques from her basic training. The facility had multiple aisles between equipment racks, offering potential hiding spots, but also creating dead ends that could trap her. Her military training had prepared her for combat situations, but nothing had prepared her for being threatened by someone wearing the same uniform. "Sergeant, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm and reasonable despite the fear coursing through her system. Hammond laughed, a sound devoid of humor that echoed off the concrete walls. "No misunderstanding, Private. You're going to learn what it really means to follow orders in my unit." The threat was explicit now, all pretense abandoned. Sarah realized with stark clarity that her military career, her safety, and possibly her life depended on the decisions she made in the next few minutes. The young woman who had dreamed of honorable service found herself facing a nightmare that had nothing to do with enemy forces or foreign battlefields. Hammond advanced slowly, savoring her fear like a predator toying with cornered prey. His movements were deliberate and confident, the bearing of someone accustomed to having his will imposed without resistance. Sarah continued backing away, her hands instinctively moving to a defensive position while her eyes searched for anything that could be used as a weapon. "You've been getting special attention from me, Martinez," Hammond continued, his voice carrying a sick satisfaction. "Other soldiers would kill for the opportunities I've been giving you. The least you can do is show some appreciation." Sarah's back hit a metal shelving unit with a sharp clang that reverberated through the facility. She was trapped between Hammond and tons of equipment, with nowhere left to retreat. Her grandfather's words echoed in her memory again, but now they carried a different meaning. "The person makes the uniform." Looking at Hammond, she saw someone who had corrupted everything the uniform was supposed to represent. "I appreciate the training opportunities, Sergeant," Sarah said, trying to appeal to whatever professional standards might still exist in Hammond's twisted mindset. "But this isn't appropriate military conduct." Hammond's face twisted with anger at her words. "Don't lecture me about military conduct, you little girl. I've been serving when you were still playing with dolls. You'll learn to show proper respect." The phrase proper respect carried implications that made Sarah's stomach turn. She realized that Hammond viewed her resistance as a personal affront to his authority rather than the natural response of someone defending herself against assault. His twisted logic had transformed abuse of power into some perverse form of military discipline. Sarah's options were running out rapidly. Fighting back against a senior NCO would result in serious disciplinary action if she survived the encounter. But submitting to Hammond's demands would destroy something fundamental inside her that no amount of military discipline could repair. She thought of her grandfather, wondering what he would do in this impossible situation. The answer came to her with sudden clarity. Her grandfather had fought in Vietnam not because he enjoyed violence, but because some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were impossible. Her dignity, her self-respect, and her refusal to be victimized were worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences to her military career. Hammond reached for her with confident arrogance, expecting compliance born of fear and military conditioning. Instead, he encountered something he hadn't anticipated, a young woman who had decided that some lines could never be crossed, no matter who was trying to cross them. What happened next would change everything, not just for Sarah Martinez, but for every soldier who had ever faced the choice between submission to abuse and the courage to stand up for what was right. The moment of truth had arrived, and Sarah was about to discover exactly what she was made of. The moment Sergeant Hammond's hand reached for Sarah's shoulder, something fundamental shifted inside her. All the military conditioning about following orders and respecting authority collided head-on with her basic human right to defend herself. Time seemed to slow as she watched his fingers extend toward her, seeing not the stripes of a senior NCO, but the predatory advance of someone who had abandoned every principle the uniform was supposed to represent. Sarah's reaction was instinctive and immediate. Her left hand shot up to deflect Hammond's reaching arm, while her right formed a fist that connected solidly with his solar plexus. The impact sent a shock through both of them, Hammond from the unexpected pain, and Sarah from the realization that she had just struck a senior non-commissioned officer. Her basic training had prepared her for hand-to-hand combat, but those lessons had focused on fighting enemies, not fellow soldiers. Hammond doubled over, gasping and clutching his chest, his face a mask of shock and rage. For a brief moment, the power dynamic had shifted completely. The predator had become vulnerable, and Sarah felt a surge of fierce satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. But she knew that moment wouldn't last long. Hammond was bigger, stronger, and fueled by an anger that had been building since his advances had first been resisted. "You little bitch," Hammond wheezed, his voice hoarse with pain and fury. "You have no idea what you just did." Sarah didn't wait to find out. Her military training had taught her that when engaged in combat, hesitation could be fatal. She dodged around Hammond's hunched form and ran toward the facility's main entrance, her boots echoing loudly on the concrete floor. Behind her, she could hear Hammond recovering, his breathing becoming more regular and his curses more coherent. The distance to the door felt infinite, though it couldn't have been more than 50 yards. Sarah's heart pounded with a combination of adrenaline and terror as she heard Hammond's footsteps beginning to pursue her. She had perhaps seconds before he recovered enough to catch her, and his longer stride would give him a significant advantage in any foot race. Just as Sarah's hand reached for the door handle, Hammond's voice roared behind her with a fury that seemed to shake the entire building. "You're not going anywhere." His hand clamped down on her shoulder with crushing force, spinning her around and slamming her back against the metal door. The impact drove the breath from her lungs and sent stars dancing across her vision. Hammond's face was inches from hers, contorted with rage and something even darker that made her blood freeze. "You want to play rough?" Hammond snarled, his grip tightening on her shoulders. "I'll show you rough." With that, he lifted Sarah off her feet and hurled her sideways into the concrete wall. The impact was devastating, sending waves of pain through her ribs and shoulder as she crumpled to the floor. For a moment, the world went gray around the edges, and Sarah fought to maintain consciousness while Hammond loomed over her like an avenging demon. The fall had knocked the wind out of her, leaving Sarah gasping and vulnerable as Hammond approached. His professional military bearing had completely evaporated, replaced by something savage that had no place in any uniform. Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that she was fighting for more than her dignity now. She was fighting for her life. Hammond reached down to grab her again, but Sarah had learned from her grandfather that the most dangerous opponent was one who had nothing left to lose. As his hands descended toward her, she rolled sideways and swept his legs with her own, sending the bigger man crashing to the floor beside her. The concrete was unforgiving, and Hammond's head struck the ground with a sound that echoed through the facility. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her ribs screaming in protest, but her mind crystal clear. She had perhaps moments before Hammond recovered, and this time she couldn't afford to hesitate. The main door was still blocked by Hammond's position, but Sarah remembered seeing a rear exit during their initial entry. She ran toward the back of the facility, weaving between equipment racks while her pursuer struggled to regain his footing. Behind her, Hammond's roar of fury indicated that he was back on his feet, and more enraged than ever. His footsteps pounded against the concrete, gaining ground despite Sarah's head start. She could hear him knocking equipment aside in his pursuit, no longer caring about stealth or maintaining the pretense of official business. The rear exit was locked, secured with a heavy padlock that would require tools or significant time to break. Sarah's heart sank as she realized she was trapped again, with Hammond's approaching footsteps growing louder by the second. She turned to face her pursuer, knowing that this confrontation would determine everything that happened next. Hammond appeared between the equipment racks, his uniform disheveled, and a thin trickle of blood running from a cut on his forehead. His breathing was labored, but his eyes burned with a fury that seemed almost inhuman. Sarah realized that any pretense of this being about military discipline or authority had been completely abandoned. This had become something primal and dangerous. "End of the line, Martinez," Hammond growled, advancing slowly and methodically. "You've caused me more trouble than you're worth, but I'm going to finish what I started." Sarah backed against the locked door, her mind racing through the limited options available to her. The equipment around her included various tools and supplies, but nothing that would serve as an effective weapon against someone of Hammond's size and training. She was going to have to rely on speed, intelligence, and whatever fighting skills she had retained from basic training. "Sergeant, you need to stop this now," Sarah said, trying one last time to appeal to whatever rational thought might remain in Hammond's mind. "This isn't who you're supposed to be." Hammond's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Who I'm supposed to be? I'm a senior NCO in the United States Army, and you're a snot-nosed private who needs to learn her place. This is exactly who I'm supposed to be." The words revealed the depth of Hammond's corruption. He genuinely believed that his rank entitled him to whatever he wanted from subordinates, that military authority extended to personal domination and abuse. Sarah realized that no appeal to his better nature would work because Hammond had convinced himself that his behavior was justified by his position. Hammond lunged forward with surprising speed, but Sarah was ready this time. She sidestepped his charge and used his momentum against him, guiding him into a stack of metal shelving that toppled over with a tremendous crash. Boxes and equipment scattered across the floor, creating a barrier between them that bought Sarah precious seconds. But Hammond was far from finished. He emerged from the debris like some unstoppable force, his uniform torn and his face bleeding from multiple cuts. The physical damage seemed only to have increased his rage, transforming him into something beyond reason or restraint. Sarah realized that this confrontation wouldn't end with words or warning shots. One of them would have to be completely incapacitated before it was over. The fallen shelving had created a maze of obstacles and scattered equipment that Sarah used to her advantage. She was smaller and more agile than Hammond, able to navigate the debris field more quickly than her larger pursuer. But Hammond's superior strength allowed him to simply bulldoze through obstacles that forced Sarah to find alternate routes. Their deadly game of cat and mouse continued among the scattered supplies, with Sarah always just ahead of Hammond's grasping hands. She could hear his breathing becoming more labored as the pursuit continued, but her own stamina was beginning to flag as well. The impact with the wall had left her ribs aching with every breath, and she knew she couldn't maintain this pace indefinitely. Sarah's salvation came from an unexpected source. Among the scattered equipment was a fire extinguisher that had fallen from its wall mount during Hammond's collision with the shelving. As Hammond rounded a corner in pursuit, Sarah grabbed the red cylinder and triggered it directly into his face. The cloud of white powder temporarily blinded Hammond and sent him stumbling backward, coughing and cursing as he tried to clear his vision. Sarah didn't waste the opportunity. She swung the fire extinguisher with all her remaining strength, connecting with Hammond's temple in a blow that sent him crashing to the ground among the scattered debris. For a moment, the facility fell silent except for Sarah's ragged breathing and the distant sound of chemical foam settling on the concrete floor. Hammond lay motionless among the wreckage, blood seeping from the wound on his head to mix with the white residue from the fire extinguisher. Sarah stood over him, the empty cylinder still clutched in her hands, hardly believing what had just transpired. The young woman who had entered that facility was gone forever, replaced by someone who had discovered the terrible truth about the gap between military ideals and military reality. Sarah Martinez had won this battle, but she was about to discover that victory would bring its own set of challenges that would test her character in ways she never could have imagined. Sarah Martinez stood motionless in the destroyed storage facility, the empty fire extinguisher heavy in her trembling hands as she stared down at Sergeant Hammond's unconscious form. White foam from the extinguisher mixed with dark blood on the concrete floor, creating a surreal tableau that seemed to belong in a nightmare rather than her military career. The silence that followed their violent confrontation felt deafening after the chaos of their battle. For several long moments, Sarah couldn't move or think clearly. Her mind struggled to process what had just occurred, alternating between relief at having survived and terror at what she had done. Hammond lay still among the scattered equipment and debris, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths that confirmed he was alive, but badly injured. A senior non-commissioned officer was unconscious on the floor, and she was the reason why. Reality crashed back into focus like a physical blow. Sarah realized that regardless of Hammond's attempted assault, she had just attacked a superior officer. The military justice system she had trusted to protect her would now likely view her as the aggressor. Hammond could claim she had lured him to the facility and attacked him, and who would believe the word of a junior enlisted soldier against a decorated sergeant with years of service? Sarah's hands shook as she set down the fire extinguisher and pulled out her cell phone. The smart move would be to call for medical assistance immediately, but doing so would also trigger an investigation that could destroy her life. She stared at the phone's screen for what felt like hours, paralyzed by the impossible choice between doing what was right and protecting herself from the consequences of that decision. Hammond stirred slightly, a low groan escaping his lips as consciousness began to return. Sarah watched him with a mixture of fear and fascination, knowing that when he fully awakened, her brief window of opportunity would close forever. Whatever she decided to do had to happen now, while she still had control of the situation. The decision came suddenly, born from the same instinct for survival that had carried her through the fight. Sarah carefully made her way through the debris field to where Hammond had dropped his keys during their struggle. She pocketed them quietly, then moved to the facility's main entrance and propped it open with a piece of broken shelving. Fresh air flowed into the musty space, and the sound of distant traffic reminded her that a normal world still existed beyond this concrete nightmare. Sarah returned to Hammond's side and knelt carefully beside him, checking his pulse and breathing to ensure he wasn't in immediate danger of dying. The head wound looked serious, but not necessarily life-threatening. Though she knew head injuries could be unpredictable, her basic first aid training told her to keep him still and call for medical help, but every survival instinct screamed that helping him would only ensure her own destruction. Instead, she began to carefully document the scene with her phone's camera. She photographed the scattered equipment, the bloodstains, the evidence of their struggle, and, most importantly, Hammond's disheveled appearance. If this situation were going to destroy her career anyway, she wanted evidence of what had really happened in that facility. The photos might not prove her innocence, but they would at least show that Hammond hadn't been an innocent victim. As Sarah worked, Hammond's breathing became more regular and his movements more purposeful. She knew he would be fully conscious soon, and when that happened, her brief advantage would evaporate completely. She had perhaps minutes to escape before he recovered enough to pursue her or call for help himself. Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. She took Hammond's cell phone from his pocket and removed the battery, effectively cutting off his ability to communicate immediately upon regaining consciousness. It was a calculated move that would buy her time, but would also make her situation infinitely worse if discovered. Tampering with evidence and interfering with an investigation were serious charges that could result in court-martial and imprisonment. With Hammond's keys in her pocket and his phone disabled, Sarah had created a window of opportunity that might allow her to escape the immediate consequences of their confrontation. But escape to what? She couldn't return to her unit and pretend nothing had happened. Hammond would report the incident as soon as he was able, and military police would be looking for her within hours. Sarah walked slowly toward the door, each step feeling like she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. The young woman who had dreamed of honorable military service was becoming something else entirely, a fugitive, a criminal, someone who had chosen survival over duty. The transformation felt like another kind of death, the murder of everything she had thought she wanted to become. At the threshold, Sarah turned back for one final look at the scene. Hammond was beginning to stir more actively, his hands moving to his head as awareness returned. In a few minutes, he would be fully conscious and undoubtedly furious. She had perhaps an hour before he would be able to leave the facility and report what had happened, maybe less if someone else discovered him first. Sarah stepped into the afternoon sunlight and walked quickly to Hammond's vehicle. Using his keys felt like another violation, another crime to add to her growing list of offenses against military law. But the alternative was to remain at the scene and face immediate arrest for assaulting a superior officer. Whatever happened next, she needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to salvage something from the wreckage of her life. The drive back toward base felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Every mile marker seemed to mock her previous dreams and ambitions. The woman who had signed enlistment papers with such pride and optimism was gone, replaced by someone who was stealing military vehicles and fleeing crime scenes. The uniform she had worn with such honor now felt like a costume, a disguise that no longer fit the person she had become. Sarah parked Hammond's truck in a public lot several miles from base, wiping down surfaces to remove her fingerprints before abandoning it. The action felt melodramatic and paranoid, like something from a bad movie, but she could no longer afford to ignore any detail that might protect her from the consequences of her actions. She was thinking like a criminal now because that's what she had become, regardless of the justifications that had led to this moment. The walk back toward base gave Sarah time to think through her rapidly diminishing options. She could return to her barracks and wait for the inevitable knock on her door from military police. She could attempt to report Hammond's assault first, hoping that her version of events would be believed over his. Or she could disappear entirely, abandoning her military career and starting over somewhere else with a new identity. Each option carried devastating consequences. Waiting to be arrested would likely result in court-martial and imprisonment for assault and theft. Reporting Hammond's assault would trigger an investigation where her word would be weighed against his rank and service record. And disappearing would make her a deserter, a fugitive from military justice who would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. As Sarah approached the base perimeter, she realized that none of her options led to anything resembling the future she had envisioned when she first put on the uniform. The military career that was supposed to provide purpose and direction had become a trap that threatened to destroy everything she valued about herself. The institution she had trusted to protect her had instead created the conditions for her victimization and then punished her for defending herself. Sarah Martinez stood at the crossroads between her past dreams and an uncertain future, knowing that whatever choice she made would define the rest of her life. The naive young woman who had believed in honor and duty was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required abandoning everything you thought you believed in. The real question wasn't what she should do, but what she was willing to become in order to survive what had been done to her. The decision came to Sarah Martinez as she sat in a 24-hour diner 3 miles from Fort Hood, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Through the greasy window, she watched military personnel coming and going from a nearby gas station, their uniforms a painful reminder of the life she was about to leave behind forever. Each passing hour made her situation more desperate, and she knew that Hammond would have been discovered by now, setting in motion a chain of events that would soon reach her. Sarah had spent the previous 6 hours in a state of paralyzed indecision, moving from place to place around the base perimeter while wrestling with choices that offered no real hope of redemption. She had called her mother twice, but hung up before the connection completed, unable to find words that could explain what her life had become. How do you tell the woman who raised you that everything she believed about your character and judgment was wrong? The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes, refilled Sarah's cup without being asked. "Honey, you look like someone who's carrying the weight of the world," she said softly. "Sometimes talking to a stranger helps more than keeping it all bottled up inside." Sarah looked up, surprised by the unexpected kindness. For a moment, she considered unburdening herself to this woman who had no connection to the military or any stake in the outcome of her crisis. But the words wouldn't come. The reality of what had happened in that storage facility felt too raw, too impossible to explain to someone living in the normal world where such things didn't happen to people in uniform. "Just having a difficult day," Sarah replied, managing a weak smile. "Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan." The waitress nodded knowingly. "That's the truth. But I found that when plans fall apart, sometimes it's because life has something better in store. You just have to be brave enough to let go of what you thought you wanted." The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. She had spent hours agonizing over how to salvage her military career, how to return to the path she had planned for herself. But maybe the waitress was right. Maybe some plans were meant to be abandoned, especially when they had led to places where survival required compromising everything you believed about yourself. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood run cold. It was from her roommate back on base. "MPs came by looking for you. Said it was urgent. Where are you?" The message confirmed what Sarah had known was inevitable. The investigation had begun, and she was now officially a wanted person. Military police would be checking her known associates, monitoring her financial accounts, and coordinating with civilian law enforcement to track her down. The window of opportunity for making a clean escape was closing rapidly. Sarah paid for her coffee and walked outside into the Texas evening. The air carried the familiar sense of barbecue and diesel fuel that she had come to associate with life near the base. But now those smells seemed to belong to someone else's memories. The Sarah Martinez who had loved those familiar comforts was being left behind, replaced by someone who had to think like a fugitive in order to survive. The next few hours passed in a blur of careful planning and desperate action. Sarah used Hammond's credit cards to withdraw cash from multiple ATMs, knowing that each transaction created a trail but needing funds for whatever came next. She purchased supplies from different stores, hair dye, cheap clothing, a prepaid cell phone, all the tools needed to become someone else. The criminal behavior felt foreign and wrong, but it was also surprisingly easy once she committed to the path. In the bathroom of a truck stop, Sarah transformed herself as completely as possible given her limited resources. She cut her long dark hair short and dyed it blonde, changed into civilian clothes that bore no resemblance to her usual style, and practiced altering her posture and mannerisms. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror was a stranger, someone who might be able to disappear into the anonymous masses of American society. Sarah's escape plan was simple but effective. She would use the cash to purchase a bus ticket to a large city where she could disappear among the crowds while she figured out her next steps. She had always been good with computers and logistics, skills that would translate to civilian employment if she could establish a new identity. The plan wasn't perfect, but it offered hope of survival in a situation where all other options led to destruction. The Greyhound station in Killeen buzzed with late-night travelers, most of whom looked like they had their own reasons for preferring bus travel to more traceable forms of transportation. Sarah fit right in among the collection of people trying to get from one life to another without leaving too many breadcrumbs for those who might want to follow. She purchased a ticket to Houston with cash, choosing a destination that offered multiple connections to anywhere in the country. As Sarah waited for her bus to board, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a proud soldier with unlimited potential and unshakable faith in the system she served. Now she was a fugitive carrying someone else's credit cards and planning to disappear into civilian society under an assumed identity. The transformation felt like a death and rebirth combined into one traumatic experience. The bus pulled away from Killeen just after midnight, carrying Sarah Martinez toward an uncertain future that held no resemblance to anything she had ever planned or dreamed. As the lights of Fort Hood faded in the rear window, she felt a mixture of grief and relief that was almost overwhelming. She was leaving behind everything she had worked for and believed in, but she was also leaving behind a system that had failed to protect her when protection was needed most. Over the following months, Sarah built a new life in Austin under the name Jennifer Collins, using forged documents and careful lies to establish an identity that couldn't be traced back to her military service. She found work in logistics for a civilian company, using skills that felt familiar but applying them to purposes that seemed almost trivially peaceful after her military training. The job paid well enough to support a modest apartment and the anonymous lifestyle she had chosen. The transformation wasn't without cost. Sarah lived in constant fear of discovery, jumping at unexpected knocks on her door and avoiding situations that might require background checks or detailed personal histories. She made few friends and maintained no romantic relationships, knowing that intimacy required honesty that could expose her carefully constructed deception. The loneliness was profound, but it felt safer than the alternative. News of Hammond's fate reached her through careful monitoring of military news sources. The sergeant had survived their encounter, but suffered a traumatic brain injury that ended his career and left him with permanent disabilities. Sarah felt no satisfaction in his suffering, only a hollow sadness that their confrontation had destroyed 2 lives instead of 1. Hammond had been prosecuted for sexual assault after other victims came forward, but that justice felt meaningless given what it had cost everyone involved. 3 years later, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her Austin apartment. Captain Rodriguez, her former company commander, had somehow tracked her down through methods he didn't explain. He arrived alone, out of uniform, and with an expression that combined sadness with something that might have been admiration. "I know what really happened in that storage facility," Rodriguez said simply. "Hammond confessed everything during his court-martial proceedings. I wanted you to know that some of us understood why you did what you did." Sarah stared at him in shock, her carefully maintained composure crumbling under the weight of validation she had never expected to receive. For 3 years, she had lived with the belief that she was viewed as a criminal and deserter by everyone she had once served alongside. To learn that her actions had been understood and even respected by at least one person from her former life felt like a gift she didn't deserve. "I can't go back," Sarah said quietly. "Too much has happened. Too many laws have been broken." Rodriguez nodded understanding. "I'm not here to ask you to come back. I'm here to tell you that what you did took more courage than most soldiers ever have to show. You defended yourself when the system failed to protect you, and you chose your own survival over blind obedience to authority. Those aren't the actions of a criminal, they're the actions of a hero." The words hung in the air between them, offering a redemption that Sarah had never dared to hope for. She wasn't the naive young woman who had believed that wearing a uniform automatically made someone honorable. But she wasn't the criminal she had feared herself to be either. She was something more complex, a person who had faced an impossible situation and chosen the difficult path of survival over the easy path of victimhood. Rodriguez left a business card before departing, explaining that he now worked with an organization that helped military veterans transition to civilian careers. If Sarah ever wanted to use her real identity again, he could help make that happen safely and legally. The offer felt like a door opening to possibilities she had thought were closed forever. Sarah Martinez, or Jennifer Collins, depending on how you counted such things, stood at her apartment window watching Rodriguez drive away into the Austin traffic. She held his business card in hands that no longer trembled with fear or uncertainty. For the first time in 3 years, she began to consider the possibility that her story might have a different ending than the one she had written for herself in that moment of desperate flight from Fort Hood. The journey from idealistic soldier to fugitive to independent survivor had been painful and costly, but it had also taught her something valuable about the difference between institutional honor and personal integrity. Sometimes the most honorable thing you can do is refuse to honor a system that has abandoned its principles. Sometimes survival requires becoming someone you never planned to be. And sometimes the person you become in crisis is closer to who you really are than the person you thought you wanted to be. Sarah Martinez had escaped more than Sergeant Hammond's assault that day in the storage facility. She had escaped a version of herself that was too trusting, too willing to believe that authority and righteousness were the same thing. The woman who had emerged from that crucible was harder, more cautious, and infinitely more self-reliant. She had lost her military career, but she had found something more valuable, the unshakable knowledge that she would never again allow anyone to make her a victim. The girl who had saluted her grandfather's photograph had grown into a woman who understood that real honor sometimes requires dishonoring the institutions that claim to represent it. And, in that understanding, she had found a different kind of service, not to country or flag, but to the principle that every person has the right to defend their dignity, even when that defense comes at a price that seems too high to pay.